Well, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau reported to be planning to resign as early as today following months of pressure from within his party. As the U.S. prepares to certify Donald Trump's election win, we ask what his return to the White House means for markets and world politics. Plus, Austria is on the verge of a government led by the far right after centrist parties tried and failed to form a coalition. Well, good morning, everyone. Let's take a look at the European markets map. First Monday, happy Monday. It's the first Monday of 2025. And there's quite a lot going on as we try and figure out the way forward for inflation and, of course, what Trump 2.0 means for stocks, but also world politics. The picture is one of gains and losses. So we're seeing quite a lot of volatility in today's trade session. We saw that in Asia. We're filtering through that to Europe. So you can see the CAC 40 gaining some 0.7%. The FTSE actually started the day a little bit higher, but is now pretty much flat. The DAX getting some 0.4%. Again, I guess investors are snapping up some pretty buoyant chip shares. The other couple of things that we need to watch out for, the 30-year yield in the U.S., probably the big one because it rose to the highest since 2023. S&P futures getting 0.3%. Look out for euro dollar, and there's quite a lot going on with China trying to support the currency. You can see actually renminbi 73289. So for the conversations that matter and the insights you need, let's get started.
Newsmakers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Canada's Globe and Mail says the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is expected to announce his resignation as Liberal Party leader this week, triggering a contest to replace him. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Katya Dmitrieva. Katya, walk us through, first of all, good morning, but walk us through the challenges that Trudeau has actually been facing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really just the latest in a series of political missteps and turmoil that has really gripped Trudeau and his party for the past few months. We're getting this reporting from the Globe and Mail, from Reuters, that Trudeau is likely to resign this week, and in fact could be as soon as Wednesday. Now, Wednesday is when the Liberal Party MPs have their caucus meeting, so that's could potentially be happening in the coming days. Now, this is sort of the latest culmination of what Trudeau has been facing, and that's included kind of historically low approval ratings from Canadians as well as from people, members of his own party. I mean, back in October, you had 24 Liberal MPs, those are MPs from his own party, signing a document saying that he should step down. Following that, Chrystia Freeland, that was his former finance minister, resigned in a very public move, citing an open letter to Canadians on Twitter and saying that they had a complete mismatch in how they want to guide the country, but more specifically in terms of like fiscal spending, in terms of the post-Trump or Trump era, and guarding against that. And then in addition, since then, we've seen a lot more members of his party coming out. And should also note that his party is not doing very well favorably. There was a poll that came out showing that if there was an election, that Conservatives would handily beat them.
So, Katya, how much of this is actually down to Donald Trump's impending return to the White House?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And that is a big part of this. You know, in a lot of ways, this tension and this turmoil has been building for some time against Trudeau. But Trump was really the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. You know, his announcement of tariffs against Canada and Mexico, but of course against Canada. The U.S. is I'm Canadian, but it's the largest trading partner for Canada, and so that took a pretty big hit. And it was after that Chrystia Freeland had resigned and said that it was actually the approach to Trump and the approach to tariffs and the America First policy that drove this sort of divide between Trudeau and between Chrystia Freeland. So this issue will continue for Canada. Of course, we have the inauguration January 20th of President Trump. For his part, so far, Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago. He met with Trump. He had a phone call with President-elect Trump after the announcement of these 25% tariffs. And so it kind of remains to be seen how any leader would really deal with President-elect Trump.
Katya, thanks so much. Katya Dmitrieva there with the very latest on Justin Trudeau. Now, for more on the markets, we're joined by Seema Shah, Chief Global Strategist at Principal Asset Management and Bloomberg's Justina Lee. Happy New Year to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Seema, I guess the concern is that it feels like a politics story, but it's never a politics story, right? Are we going to see a lot more politics entering your world as we try and figure out Trump 2.0?
Oh my gosh, I think politics has to be in every single consideration that we take this year, which is a really uncomfortable environment, I think, for investors. Typically what we've seen is that politics doesn't really have a sustained impact on markets. But in this year, we're looking at politics which could have a really meaningful impact on growth, not just in the US, but obviously globally, in fact, more importantly for global growth. And then, of course, what's happening with inflation. So this is really at the heart of a lot of the investment decisions that people are going to be making this year.
Yeah, and Justina, again, we saw a little bit of, weakness in the Canadian dollar, but this feels bigger, actually, into what it could become.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a bit of a relief today, because maybe just Justin Trudeau's position hadn't been tenable for a while. And so there's this sense that, OK, finally, we saw the headline. We're going to see change there. But I think Canada is facing a lot of the same challenges that a lot of countries that trade with the U.S. are facing, which is that, kind of with the differential in the interest rate and with kind of the tensions on the trade front. It seems like for a lot of currencies, they're headed for further weakness against the dollar. We're seeing that in China, of course. And the question is can you take that weakness?
Yeah, and Seema, again, how do you wade through all of the news? I guess we watch for inflation in the U.S. We kind of, tend to forget that we had a pretty hawkish Jay Powell like 3 weeks ago. And then with Trump policies, what does it mean for where investors should be looking at?
But I think the obvious trade, as you were just saying, is that it's really about global growth tending to suffer, a lot of the currencies depreciating against the dollar. That suggests U.S. equities. But we also have to recognise that valuations are really, really extended at the moment. So it becomes quite a difficult discussion to take. So you do have to have some kind of global diversification, ideally focused on countries that have less trade exposure with the US, who are somewhat less vulnerable. But certainly this is the time for diversification because politics tends to throw up a lot of surprises and investors don't want to have all their eggs in one basket.
So what does that look like in terms of portfolio? Because there's also so much appetite, I think, for U.S. stocks that you're going to have much less returns if you're not attached to the U.S.
Absolutely. So you still need to have some exposure to the U.S. We are still overweight U.S. equities. We've adjusted the position within the U.S. to not just overweight some of the large caps, but also mid and small. So you're trying to get a broad exposure. But also within the equity space, looking at places like India, Japan, which tend to be a little bit less vulnerable than many other countries, Mexico, Canada, for example, even Europe. And then, of course, look, fixed income. If you have got any concerns about where growth is going, then it makes sense to have some kind of exposure to fixed income. We do think that credit will be OK. Spreads are really, really tight, but at least you're getting some kind of meaningful yields to get that carry. And then, you mentioned inflation risks are still really, really patent in 2025, more so, I think, than they were in 2024. So getting some exposure to real assets, whether it's commodities, real estate, that tends to be really important for this kind of environment.
When you look at, I guess, price valuations, it seems that U.S. stocks are priced perfection. What will give them a leg higher?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, despite the higher valuations, they're pointing at the fact that the U.S. is still growing at a faster pace and the earnings are still growing at a faster pace. And to be honest, if you look at the last few years, it just feels like, high valuations were never an obstacle to further gains in the U.S. But I think for a lot of people who are concerned about that part, they are wondering if they should even rotate into, those way cheaper small and mid caps, which really haven't really seen any outperformance in the last 10 years or so. But if we really are going to see more reshoring, more deregulation, maybe it's finally time to go to some of those smaller U.S. companies.
Seema, what do you do with fixed income?
Within fixed income, as I said, credit is still a good place to be. If you don't believe there's going to be a recession, then you're not expecting defaults to spike. In which case, credit spreads should, there's maybe a little bit range bound, maybe somewhat biased, slightly higher. But as long as you're getting a meaningful pickup in yield, well, that should be a good environment for credit. We still like preferred securities. Typically, that exposure to financial, to utilities is important. There is some safety within there as well. So there are places within credit. US Treasuries is a difficult one at the moment. You want to have a little bit of duration exposure. But we were not expecting US Treasury yields, at least on the long end, to trend meaningfully lower this year, despite a Fed cutting cycle.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride. Thank you both for joining us. Justina Lee and Seema Shah from Principal asset management. I'm losing my voice because I haven't talked for such a long time. Coming up, what a difference 4 years can make from a riot on Capitol Hill to formally certifying Donald Trump's re-election victory. We have the latest from Washington. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Now, 4 years ago, a mob attacked the U.S. Capitol as Donald Trump tried to overturn his election loss to Joe Biden in 2020. 4 years later, U.S. lawmakers will meet to formally certify Donald Trump's re-election as president after his defeat of Joe Biden late last year. Now, it's a remarkable turn of events and one that President Biden is urging Americans not to forget. Now, let's bring in Bloomberg's Jill Deesis in Hong Kong and Bloomberg senior writer Stephanie Baker here in London. Jill, let's start off with you. What's expected between now and inauguration a few weeks from now?
Well, at this point, Francine, there's a couple of things in this timeline. So, tomorrow or today in the U.S. Really is when we have the voting, the certification of votes for Donald Trump to ultimately become president. This prior to the last instance of January 6, 2021, was really kind of a non-event. But obviously, given the events of that day, what we're now seeing is actually quite a lot of security sort of ramped up around this particular event at the Capitol. It's actually being designated as a special national security event, which means that the U.S. Secret Service can kind of come in and give additional resources to sort of protect the integrity of the day, make sure that people are protected. It's kind of showing that even if there's been no massive political consequences for Donald Trump, for example, but there is still sort of that lingering memory of what happened in 2021, and that's ultimately kind of moving through to this ramped up security that we have. And then obviously post that once Donald Trump actually, is inaugurated, becomes president, there's a pretty high expectation that he may end up granting clemency to the, 1,000 or so people that have so far either been prosecuted or sort of in the process of being prosecuted for events taking place in 2021.
And Jill, if we look at policy, so House Speaker Mike Johnson survived a razor-thin vote to remain in place. What does that mean for Trump's legislative agenda?
Well, I mean, really, Francine, a huge reason why he actually ended up getting that razor-thin majority was because he received an endorsement from Trump. So one thing that House Speaker Johnson has really pledged to do is kind of get some kind of a mega bill, this, massive piece of legislation sort of through the House by May is what he is saying. And that would include, something that really touches on all of the kind of key policy tenets that Trump, touted during his campaign. A lot of that involves, some kind of funding for mass deportations, related to, a lot of the Republican concerns about illegal immigration. You've also got some pledges in there to sort of renew the Trump tax cuts of 2017, which expired this year. And then a third piece of that is to address something along the lines of either expanding or removing the debt limit. That's been something that Donald Trump has really kind of touted in recent weeks. Of course, there's a pretty big question as to whether or not, the Republicans can actually get something through there. Johnson's expecting to use some kind of a simple majority in the Senate to help the House kind of get that over the line. But there's still a bit of disagreement among Republicans about whether or not they want to do this all as one big package, if that's possible, or kind of divide it up. That's kind of what we're setting the stage for, at least in the first half of this year. We'll have to see whether the Republicans can kind of come together on that and actually get that kind of legislation through.
Jill, thank you so much. Now, we also heard, Stephanie, Elon Musk is all over UK news. There seems to be an obsession between him and politicians here in the UK. He was supporting Reform UK, then he was against Nigel Farage. He wants to be kingmaker. Is there anyone who can rein him in?
It's an extraordinary situation. You have the richest man in the world who donated more than $250 million to help get Trump elected, intervening in UK politics, attacking a British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer's role in the handling of grooming gangs as the director of public prosecutions. He's made a series of false allegations about him. And then he had been supporting reform, as you say, supporting Nigel Farage. They met just 3 weeks ago. And then Musk turned on him and said he's no longer qualified to lead the Reform Party. Now, there had been, talk about Musk giving something like $100 million to reform, to kind of supercharge their efforts to sort of take over UK politics. That appears to perhaps have died because Nigel Farage now has hit back at Musk for his support of Tommy Robinson, this far-right leader who's in prison on contempt of court charges. Musk seems to be advancing this idea that Robinson is in prison because of his comments on grooming gangs, and that's not the case. He's actually in contempt of court over a libel claim about some allegations he made against a Syrian refugee. So it's just an extraordinary situation, and it's compounding problems for Starmer. A rocky first 6 months. He's expected to hit back at it today, probably without directly attacking Musk, so as to not give further oxygen to this.
But Stephanie, does it impact actually the way people think about the UK? Is it problematic for Donald Trump? So it's definitely problematic for Keir Starmer. Does it change the way people could vote in the future?
Well, Musk obviously has a huge influence over Trump's thinking, and there could be Trump has threatened tariffs. So Keir Starmer needs to keep relations with the U.S. on track to head off those tariffs. The Labour Party has vowed to kickstart economic growth in the UK, so U.S. tariffs on the UK would be disastrous for his agenda. So I think it is important. Musk is very influential, is the sort of court jester in Trump world, and they need to keep relations with him on track.
Thank you so much, Jill Deeses in Hong Kong, and our senior writer, Stephanie Baker, who also returns a little bit later this hour. We'll have plenty more to come. We'll be back with Seema Shah. We'll talk markets. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. UK business confidence has dropped to its lowest level since the former Prime Minister Liz Truss's disastrous mini-budget more than 2 years ago. Well, still with us, Seema Shah from Principal Asset Management. Seema, away from the UK kind of Elon Musk saga, which we're still waiting to see how it plays out, UK business confidence, the lowest level in quite some time.
Yeah, and that's going to be a real shock, almost a disappointment to Keir Starmer and Rach Reeves. After their budget, they thought they'd done a lot of work towards increasing or improving the attractiveness of the UK. And if anything, what they've done, or at least what's happened, is that UK business confidence in response to those tax changes has plummeted. And as we talk about international investors, they're not looking at the UK in a very favourable light at the moment either.
And so what does it mean do you stay away from UK assets, or is there something to be played in?
Well, it's an interesting story because the fundamental picture for the UK is fairly dismal. It doesn't have at least the political instability of Europe. It doesn't have quite the negative growth trajectory of Europe, but it's still struggling. And then you have this discontent, which is growing. But on the other hand, valuations are fairly cheap, and you have actually had investors becoming really pessimistic about the UK. So with the government coming in and talking about new plans, especially in the next month or so with some announcements, if there is anything meaningful, particularly with relationship towards Europe or anything, you could see a sudden shift where sentiment is so negative at the moment. Valuations are quite cheap. It doesn't need much to attract investors, at least from an asset allocation perspective, to the UK. But it is a bit of a touch and go at the moment.
And this would be what, FTSE 100? Or would you play it through other... I guess FTSE 250 means that you have a lot of exposure to UK weakness.
Right, exactly. So FTSE 100 is the general place that people are looking, at least that you have got exposure to the US, some areas of strength. But the FTSE 250 also has some potential. If you're going to see some improvement to the potential for UK fundamentals, investors start to really believe that there is a confidence story growing. There is some movement to happen there. But as I said, we are really waiting to see what the government's going to come up with.
Seema, we started the conversation saying, look, because of all the political uncertainty, especially on tariffs and trade, given Trump 2.0, you have to diversify. Where do you look for that? Because all of Europe seems to be changing because of the nature of even domestic politics, and emerging markets are still quite exposed to dollar.
It's really true. It's a very, very difficult story at the moment. We talk about global diversification, but as you look around the world, you start to struggle to see really compelling stories. Now, on a valuation map, the US is by far the most expensive, probably the most expensive it's been in history. So that is a challenge for investors. So inevitably, you look outside. Europe is really cheap. But the fundamentals are so disappointing at the moment that it's very difficult to get any kind of investor interest. The one, I guess, highlight would be that if there is some improvement, valuations are so cheap that you could get a meaningful move up. So again, it's something to watch, but at the moment, it's not somewhere that we would want to have an overweight exposure to. So in terms of where do you look, India is expensive, but the fundamental story is quite positive. It's also somewhat immune, or at least less vulnerable to US tariffs. And at the same time, as we've seen in the last few years, any kind of disappointment in China, you start to see those flows moving to India. So vulnerability for China continues to be a positive story for India. So that's one area that we are continuing to look at. And then for Japan, where valuations are probably around historical averages, those corporate reforms continue. It's also less vulnerable to US tariffs.
Seema, thank you so much. Seema Shah there, Chief Global Strategist at Principal Asset Management. Coming up, Austria's far-right leader gets a chance to form a government. We'll have the latest next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. The Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is reported to be planning to resign as early as today, following months of pressure within his party. As the U.S. prepares to certify Donald Trump's election win, we ask what his return to the White House means for world politics. Plus, Austria is on the verge of a government led by the far right after centrist parties tried and failed to form a coalition. Now let's stay with that story. And Austria's anti-immigrant Freedom Party is creeping closer to appointing its first chancellor after receiving an invitation by the nation's president to discuss forming a government. Now, the development comes after efforts to form a centrist coalition collapsed and the conservative chancellor, Karl Nehammer, resigned. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Oliver Crook. Ollie, good morning. So what's the latest we're hearing from Vienna?
Yeah, Francine. So listen, this is a really interesting sort of political saga that really began in September. So this has been going on for a very long time. And over that course of time, they basically failed to form a government. So the number one party, the party that actually won that election, was the far right, the Freedom Party, Mr. Kickle, who was iced out from any political negotiations. So wasn't really given a mandate to try to form a government or to become chancellor because, like in many countries across Europe, the far right has been isolated. And basically there is a firewall that prevents any of the mainstream parties to agree to go into coalition. That led ways to very difficult coalition discussions with the center-right, the center-left, and the Liberals, which over the weekend collapsed, leading to the chancellor, the sort of incumbent who was trying to form this government, basically resigning not only as chancellor, but also as the head of the party. What that now leaves in Austria is the possibility initially of potentially a new election, but what seems now to be the more likely outcome is that basically that the leader of the far-right movement will be given an audience with the president today at 11 a.m. and will be potentially able to form a government with the new head of the Conservative Party, who has sort of softened on this position. And if, Francine, this sounds at all familiar to you, this is exactly the same movie that we are seeing play out across France, across the Netherlands, and increasingly across Germany, where basically these mainstream parties are trying to form alliances in order to block out the far right, and basically are coming to a point now where they're finding the resistance and the sort of limit to that political approach. We see it in France with Le Pen. We're seeing it increasingly in Germany with the AfD, which is going to be very hard to form a government if they have 20% of the vote. And add to it, Francine, another final dimension which unifies all of these stories: very slow growth within Europe, and as a consequence, very difficult budgets and a lot of money missing in order to try to bring these governments together and bring sort of political cohesion to what is increasingly looking like a paralyzed Europe.
But, Ollie, so is this Musk's influence with money that's re-energizing the right and the far right in Europe?
So what I think is very interesting, Francine, is that the other sort of dimension that is becoming increasingly universal is Musk's influence and his sort of weighing in on politics. I mean, it is now the number one story politically in Germany is Musk's influence over what is going on in Germany. We have heard from him. We have had him endorse the AfD. On Thursday, he will hold a sort of Twitter X space with Alice Weidel, who is the head of the AfD party, hoping to use some of the sort of techniques that were very successful in the U.S. election around podcasting, the Rogan effect, potentially trying to boost from the AfD. What is interesting about this technique and this approach is, of course, the political establishment, the mainstream within Germany, very, very concerned. We heard from Olaf Scholz speaking again over the weekend, saying that Germany is governed by the will of its citizens and not by the erratic statements of a billionaire from the United States. But the AfD, for their part, we've reached out to them, the far right, and this is what they had to say. I think this is very interesting, Francine. In view of Musk's outstanding role in the coming Trump administration, we also believe it is important for the German-American relations if the AfD, a significant political force, can build diplomatic bridges. So they are saying here, not only is Musk helpful because of his influence online, but also his credibility as a businessman to help give the AfD a bit of credibility. They see this as a direct line into influence over the next Trump White House. Very, very interesting, particularly since the AfD has been so critical in the past about American influence on European politics, American influence within Germany, but really seemingly not having such an issue when it is in their support. And of course, also one of their chapters in Brandenburg is standing against the Tesla factory that Elon Musk has there. So it's a really sort of interesting story to see how it'll develop. And I'm sure that a lot of people will watch that conversation between Elon Musk and Alice Weidel on Thursday evening.
Yeah, they certainly will. Ollie, thanks so much. Ollie Crook there with the very latest, of course, on Austria, but the wider effect of Elon Musk on Europe. Now, for more on the influence of Elon Musk and President-elect Donald Trump, with just 2 weeks until inauguration, let's bring in Tina Fordham, founder of Fordham Global Foresight, and Bloomberg senior writer Stephanie Baker. So, Stephanie, thank you so much for coming back on. Tina, Happy New Year. You have a risk map, basically, in saying, like, the chaos theory. I mean, there's a lot of things that could be strange in the next couple of weeks. What are you expecting in terms of policies from Donald Trump day one?
Well, there's what Trump has said he will do on day one, and then what he is able to do using executive authority, what he needs congressional support to achieve, and there we know he's got a very slim majority in the House, and many Republicans actually are thinking about midterms in 2 years, so they may not fall into line. And then there are the measures he's suggested, which will run into problems in the courts. So if we look at market sentiment, all the good stuff is expected to take place. It's all good for equities, and that's quite positive. And there's a very good mood at the start of the year. But as we wrote over the weekend, there's been a violent start to 2025. There are a huge number of moving pieces and wild cards. No one foresaw the implosion of Syria, for example, the resignation of Justin Trudeau that's expected. You just had this segment on right-wing populists. The fact that these developments are not very well understood or very quantifiable basically means that they're getting left out of the risk analysis.
What are you watching out for, Stephanie? Because there is a lot going on, and I guess, as Tina's saying, some of it is not quantifiable.
No, it's not. I mean, you're looking at Trump having an effect across the world without even entering the White House. Of course, since I wrote a book called Punishing Putin about the economic war against Russia, I'm very much focused on what Trump might do to bring about a ceasefire in Ukraine. You see the Biden administration rolling out tougher sanctions to put Ukraine in the best possible negotiating position when Trump comes in. You see Russia incurring huge casualties, trying to gain minimal amounts of territory in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians, during their incursion in Kursk, have launched another offensive to retake territory that they have lost since that incursion began in August. Once again, to put themselves in the best possible negotiating position when Trump comes into office. I'm quite skeptical that Trump can do a deal. I think Putin's goals haven't really changed. I think Putin wants some respite from sanctions, so the increased sanctions gives Trump leverage, actually, to do a deal. But I think there's just so many moving parts, and Trump is having such an outsized effect without even taking office.
Yep. We were talking before, Stephanie, about Elon Musk really weighing in on UK politics. I mean, he also came up with a peace plan for Ukraine. Do we know what that relationship between Elon Musk and Donald Trump means going forward for also Russia?
Well, Musk was in the room for some of his, discussions with the Ukrainian leader Zelensky, but I think that the Ukraine peace talks. There's so many different moving parts that need to be resolved. Trump's pick, his special envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, has said reassuringly that it would be a disaster if Ukraine lost the war. But trying to come up with some kind of workable peace plan that involves giving some kind of security assurances to Ukraine, and that's the buzzword I heard in D.C. last month. The security assurances, not guarantees. Is that going to be enough to stop the fighting? Or is it going to be a repeat of 2014 and 2015, where the Minsk agreements stopped sort of the outright conflict, but Russia comes back to take another bite at the cherry later in the year? So I think it really depends on the degree to which Trump can kind of put pressure on Zelensky. And do a deal with Putin. And perhaps I think he's probably going to offer him some kind of limited sanctions relief to try to get him to the table.
Tina, in your 2025 Outlook Global Risk Map, you have, Israel, Gaza, you have Iran. You also have a section on EU cohesion. Is that going to splinter?
Well, this is the risk. I mean, Euro pessimism is very much the order of the day. I am a little bit more constructive, I think, than most when it comes to that, because here in Europe we are most exposed to what happens between Russia and Ukraine. The undersea cable cutting over the Christmas period was another reminder of what we warn about in terms of gray zone operations. The question is whether Europe can get its act together, and this means getting through German elections. We're optimistic that Friedrich Merz will be the next chancellor. The Musk effect, in my view, is a little bit overdone when it comes to Germany. We really don't see any movement in the polls since Musk's poorly received op-ed and his interventions. But then, of course, there's France to be concerned about. Italy, for its part, doing very well with
they're signing deals
with
in
Musk.
Mar-a-Lago.
Yes, and she's got the upper hand. But we have to be really careful about geopolitical kind of behavioral risk. We've got behavioral economics. Now we need to worry about how to deal with narcissists when it comes to geopolitics. And what I mean by that is you're only ever as good as the last thing you did for them.
I mean, does China have it, the worse off?
Does China have
the worse off in terms of tariffs and trade, or is that already priced in?
Well, China is going to. This is what I think is really important. In this period, as Stephanie said, Ukraine's trying to improve its negotiating position. China and others that will be on the sharp end of sanctions, but especially China, are going to try to signal their strength and their resolve. They're not just going to sit around and wait for Trump to hit them with sanctions.
Stephanie, internally, so there's a lot of expectations in terms of regulation. The stocks are expected to go even higher, but then there's all, I guess, the worrying signs of, for example, pardoning the rioters of January 6th. Is that going to change American politics from within?
Yeah, it's very interesting because Trump's popularity within the Republican Party is at an all-time high. He has transformed the Republican Party over the past 8 years. But this issue of, his potential pardoning of the January 6th attackers is a deeply unpopular move. So I think it remains to be seen how that plays out. I think he'll likely ride that out without too much opposition. It's extraordinary how he's changed the narrative about what happened on January 6th. From a violent attack on the Capitol where people died, and he's now calling it a day of love. And I think it shows his use of disinformation and his ability to manipulate the narrative is just extraordinary. So I think he'll be able to get away with pardoning those January 6 attackers without too much political blowback.
Tina, again, in your great chart, you talk about the wild cards. And what are the wild cards? Because you have everything else in here. I mean, there's like German election, energy security, populism, China slowdown, Taiwan tensions, inflation, tariffs, regulation. What should we worry about that we're not taking account?
I think it's important when we look at that chart, right? What we've done is map out the existing risk factors in the context of the economic and market backdrop, and the extent to which the Trump effect is an accelerant of existing weaknesses. And I think, for example, the quicker collapse of governments and resignations that we're seeing. That's more likely in Europe because we have a parliamentary system in many countries. And so you have coalitions which can collapse and call early elections. So I think a wave of early elections is likely as governments struggle to deal with greater demands for defense spending, as well as how to deal with tariffs and changes in global trade. That is one of the key risk factors for me.
And Stephanie, I mean, we're still trying to figure out a lot of the people in the administration. So Marco Rubio at State, Scott Bessent at Treasury. Will they be independent, or actually will Donald Trump do all policy?
Well, he has picked loyalists to be in his cabinet this time around. And I think he has a better understanding of the way Washington works. I think there'll probably be less turnover and churn within the Trump orbit this time around. But, it's very hard to predict. As Tina mentioned, he is mercurial. We don't really know how he'll react to certain events, but he is on the same page as Marco Rubio. I think he wants Scott Bessent in charge of Treasury because he is well liked by the markets. But how far he's able to push his tariff agenda, I think, Scott Bessent has maybe perhaps been a little bit more cautious about how they use tariffs. That could be a point of division down the line.
Great. Thank you both for joining us. Tina Fordham, founder of Fordham Global Foresight, and Bloomberg senior writer Stephanie Baker, with a book out that came out 4 months ago called, of course, Punishing Putin. And now coming up, Italy is reportedly in talks with SpaceX for a deal to provide secure telecoms for the government. So we'll have the details on that Bloomberg scoop next. This is Bloomberg. Now, Bloomberg understands that Italy is in advanced talks with SpaceX for a deal to provide secure telecoms for the government. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Southern Europe managing editor, Tommaso Emhart. Tommaso, first of all, congratulations to you and the team, because that's a pretty significant scoop. What do we know about the deal being discussed?
So we know that the discussions are ongoing between the Italian government and Starlink, SpaceX division for the satellite network, because Italy is looking to find a secure way to keep its communication, also for its defense industry. We know that talks have been going on for a while. Clearly now, after Meloni's trip during the weekend to meet Trump, it looks like talks are real advanced. So it's quite interesting development on that front, and also shows once again how Elon Musk is influencing the Italian business arena, and the connection between the Meloni's government and the new administration are getting quite close.
So, Tommy, what's been the reaction in Italy?
I have to say that the story is today on the front page of main Italian newspaper, because the Meloni's trip to meet Trump was a real surprise, and we broke the news as soon as she came back that these talks have been going on. For sure, we know that talks have been going on for months, so it's not a consequence of her trip, but clearly the fact that Italy has been discussing for a while to get a Starlink contract with Starlink is quite interesting. That we are talking about the communication of the military system in the country. We know that Italy have been looking for a while to find a secure system for its communication. The alternative to Starlinks, according to our report, are much more expensive. We're talking about 10 billion euros. So it looks like Musk's satellite division could be a good solution also in terms of expenses for the Italian government.
And the Italian Prime Minister, Tommy, Giorgia Meloni, flew to Florida to meet President-elect Donald Trump at the weekend. What do we know about the meeting? And was that really the winning kind of extra thing that made him look at this deal?
It's quite interesting about the meeting that it was a real surprise. Italian newspaper reported that not all the government was aware that Meloni was going to meet Trump over the weekend. And then obviously this shows once again how Giorgia Meloni is becoming pivotal in the European landscape. As odd as it seems for someone as you and me who are, have both Italian roots, Italy seems to be one of the more stable countries in Europe nowadays, and it's becoming an important, Rome is becoming an important place for the U.S. government. Also, it's interesting to note that the President Joe Biden, is coming to Rome in the next few days for his last overseas trip to meet, obviously, the Pope, but also to meet Meloni.
So interesting. Tommy, thank you so much. Tommaso Emmerhardt there, Bloomberg's Southern Europe managing editor. Now, coming up, the world's largest maker of iPhones beats expectations on strong AI demand. We have the latest on Hon Hai next, and this is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. Now, European chip shares are higher following a rally in U.S. peers on Friday. Microsoft's commitment to invest further in data centers also hands a potential boost to companies helping to build cutting-edge AI chips. Now, meanwhile, Hon Hai, the world's largest maker of Apple iPhones, reported better than expected revenue growth on stronger demand for AI. Let's also look at what Apple's doing pre-market, getting some 0.7% Now let's bring in Bloomberg's Tom McKenzie. Tom, there's so much going on in AI that's kind of like flying through the roof when it comes to a lot of these chip makers. But break down the number for us and how much of this demand is really coming from AI.
Yeah, and we're constantly looking for those litmus tests and those companies that can tell a broader story. And Hon Hai, or Foxconn as it was formerly known as well, is certainly one of those companies. The revenue growth in the most recent quarter, then in the last 3 months, $65 billion. $65 billion. Just in the month of December, revenues increased more than 40%. And as you said, a lot of that was coming down to the sale of the data center servers that go into these AI data centers, to the point where Hon Hai actually thinks the revenues they get from the cloud business that includes the servers will match that of iPhones, which typically has been the greatest revenue driver for Hon Hai historically. They think that happens in 2025. Goldman Sachs has looked at these numbers and said they're going to raise their expectations in terms of earnings for Hon Hai, not just for 2025, but for the 2 years following as well. So Goldman Sachs, a positive reading from them on the earnings. Citi coming out with a view that maybe the stock could be challenged in weeks going forward because the outlook for the current quarter a little softer than some had expected. But broadly, it reminds us that demand for the hardware, for the infrastructure underpinning AI is still there.
And Tom, there's also an amazing big take actually today out with a conversation with Sam Altman. What do we find out?
This is an absolutely fascinating read. Look, Sam Altman does give interviews, increasingly rarely, but none that I've seen recently that have this much colour. And it goes all the way back to the founding of the business back in 2014, through, of course, that momentous weekend, November of 2023, when he was ousted as the CEO, to the current day and his views into the future as well. Some of the standout points: he thinks artificial general intelligence, or AGI, human-like intelligence, he thinks that will come about under the presidency of Donald Trump. Not because of Trump, just in that time frame, in the next 4 years. He donated, by the way, $1 million of his own money to the inauguration front of Trump. He says, look, there are some things I disagree with him on, some things I agree with. This isn't political. It's about having a relationship when that technology comes to bear. So those are some of the key standouts. He also thinks on the energy front, he thinks nuclear fusion will solve that conundrum for AI.
It is so interesting. Everyone should go and read our big take from today. Tom, thank you so much. Tom McKenzie there with the very latest on Hon Hai and Sam Altman. Up next, Bloomberg Brief, Danny Berger and Manus Cranny in New York. Happy Monday, everyone. This is Bloomberg.